Today we're going to talk about grief. The reason is we will all go through grief, but really we don't talk about it. I think it's because it's very uncomfortable because we don't know really how to comfort people around us who are grieving. And in a lot of ways, we're taught not to grieve, like it's not okay to show our emotions. So that's what we're going to cover today.
A lot of times people associate grief with sadness, or they might even make them synonymous. Like, if I'm grieving, I must be sad. But really, grief is that mix of emotions in response to a loss. You know, someone could pass away, and that's a loss, and you feel sad, but you might also feel relief if they had gone through, they're battling a disease. Then there's this relief that it's finally over. You could also have happy, fun, reminiscent memories, and that produces more of a more positive emotion. And so grief is not sadness, and loss is not just death either. Loss is the end of or change in a familiar pattern. There's so many losses that we go through. We're taught how to acquire things in life, but we're not taught what to do when we lose them. And so that's kind of what we want to cover today.
There are a lot of different things in life that could produce grief through loss. So a couple that are really obvious are death and divorce. But people don't really think about other types of loss, such as what about when you move your family to a different state or a different city, and the child had all their friends and now they feel like they're alone somewhere else. That can be a grieving time, or even a spouse that doesn't have friends or family around them. That could be a time of loss. A death of a pet. There are people who take that sort of death very difficult. I mean, it was a family friend for the last 17 years, and super faithful and brought lots of joy, and now it's not there anymore. Your pet is not alive.
Other examples, for instance, graduation. That brings up a lot of emotion for people. It's a loss, and it produces grief. That's the response to loss. People often don't know what to do with themselves after they graduate, and so they're looking for a job, or they don't know, did I choose the wrong field? And there's all this mix of emotions. Even though they're happy and excited that they graduated, it's an accomplishment, but all of a sudden they might go through almost like a postpartum depression, but a post-graduation depression, because there's this mix of emotions now that they're faced with so many options or lack of options.
And it's really confusing to the person that's grieving, because they feel like they should be feeling something else. Like, I should be feeling happy right now, but why am I feeling down? This doesn't make sense. And everybody's patting them on the back like, oh, great job. Same thing with a lot of these other things that cause grief. It's a very confusing emotion to the people who go through it, I think.
And then for the people who are trying to support them through it. Other examples are like financial losses. And again, it could be positive or negative. You could go through a huge transition financially for the positive, and then all of a sudden you're struck with grief because there's this mix of emotions.
You've lost coworkers, you moved to a different department.
There's
so many different things here. But grief, I think, is more common than people think. They just feel, I'm just going through it, or I'm just feeling confused on something. But maybe that confusion is really what you're dealing with is grief.
And something that can come up with couples is when one couple was experiencing some sort of addiction, and then they go through recovery, and the spouse is trying to support them through that, and they're excited that they're going through recovery, and they're thankful, and they're relieved, but then they also have all this stuff haunting them from the past, and they're wondering if it's going to happen again, and so they're both grieving through that. And they're anticipating negative outcomes even in hope of positive outcomes. So again, it sounds contradictory, but grief is that. It's that mix of emotions in response to a loss.
Something we were talking about it before, and she brought up trauma. How trauma or sexual abuse, emotional abuse can be a signal the end of a relationship, or the end of, feeling like you own your own body, like it was given away without your consent. And that could be a sort of grief that people go through.
It's a violation to one's own body. So loss of control over one's own body, loss of trust, loss of safety. So those are all reasons that people might grieve. One reason, and I actually experienced this myself, so I'll share a little bit, but getting married can be a loss in and of itself. And while I was in pure bliss land about getting married to the love of my life, I also, as a teenager, moved to another state. The weather was different. I think it rained 300 days out of the year, and I was used to sunny California.
No problem for me. Coffee was great, married life.
Yeah. But, I was involved in campus ministries and Bible quizzing and traveling and all of these social things. And then I got married and moved to this small town on the Oregon coast, and I think I gained like 20 pounds in the first year that we got married. I was pretty depressed, even though I was very happy to be with my husband. And so, again, it sounds contradictory, but it's that mix of emotions in response to a loss. And remember, loss is the end of or change in a familiar pattern. So we kind of wanted to normalize it first, just to help you realize that we all go through grief because we all experience changes in our familiar pattern.
Let's switch gears and talk about grieving for the person that's actually going through it. There is no right way to grieve. Everybody has their own way of going through it. I think there are some unhealthy ways to grieve, but there is no right way. Kubler-Ross came up with the different steps or stages of grief. And really, that was not intended for grieving like a death or like loss in this sense. It was actually to prepare the person for death, for their own death.
Right.
So it's not as helpful, even though they're very widespread and people talk about them. It's really not meant for the person that is actually going through grief in this sense that we're talking about today.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, the first stage of those 5 stages is denial, and then there's anger. Well, there's so many losses you go through that you're not going to experience a sense of denial. Even the death of a loved one, they battled a long disease and they passed away. You're not going to go, I don't believe that they actually passed away, most likely. So when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote the 5 stages, the denial, she said, was common to most people who are expecting their own death. So they were given a terminal prognosis, and then they said, I'm in disbelief. I'm in a sense of denial. And then I'm angry at God or at the doctors. And those 5 stages tend to fit when someone's kind of anticipating their own death. But they don't fit very well, definitely not in succession when we're talking about how we grieve. And so don't think of those 5 stages as a way that you have to grieve in order to go through the stages properly. They weren't written for that.
When we are grieving, we experience a confusing, conflicting amount of emotions, but we also have physical symptoms as well, or the ways that we interact with the world changes. We see things differently. And there's probably for several different reasons. I mean, sleep patterns change. Yeah. That's going to change your perception of the day. Your eating habits change.
Sometimes they experience that numbness, but then the next day they might experience a roller coaster of emotion where they have, this elevated mood. Right. And it's not bipolar. It's just this roller coaster that you experience as part of grief.
That's why some days you could feel great. You could feel almost normal. And then one little thing during that day will trigger that memory, and it'll kind of throw you back into it, or maybe a couple of days and then trigger you. And so this is normal. This isn't you, this isn't you losing your mind.
Yeah.
This is totally normal. This is going through the normal grieving process.
Adam mentioned earlier that there are some unhealthy ways to grieve, even though there's no right way to grieve. And some of those unhealthy things, we call them STIRBs. So it stands for short-term energy relieving behavior, so STIRBs. And those are things that you want to try to avoid. And that's like alcohol, turning to the bottle, gambling, shopping as a way of grieving, even emotional eating can be a way of grieving that is unhealthy. Because if you turn to STIRBs, those short-term energy relieving behaviors, then you might be more prone to addiction, and it can be more difficult to return to normal everyday life. Even though it's a new normal, you want to get back to a new normal rather than staying stuck in the STIRB behaviors.
A lot of people also turn to work. So they just become workaholics, or they distract themselves. Really, these are distractions, right? So a lot of these things are good things, but to an excess.
Right.
So if you're doing if you're trying to get away, get it out of your head, and you're doing it too much, those could be damaging in the long run. Sometimes you do need to distract yourself. So it's just being careful about how much and what you're doing.
Yeah. There's a good book by John James and Russell Friedman called The Grief Recovery Handbook. And they actually wrote this book too, When Children Grieve. And we use these books as textbooks in a grief and loss class that I teach for Wilson University. And they're excellent books if you want to grab them. But they really are aligning well with what we're sharing here, that grief is not sadness. It's the mixture of emotions. And that loss is not just death. It's the end of or change in a familiar pattern. So, we've talked about, how not to grieve, and then that there's no right way to grieve. And then we also want to share with you some things not to say as the supporter of your spouse or supporter of somebody who's grieving. So a few things not to say. One of the most common ones that we hear is someone will be like, don't feel bad or don't cry. And that's not a great way to support someone who's grieving, because essentially you're telling them it's not okay to feel or show your emotions or the full range of emotions with me. And so you're actually pushing them to isolate, to emotionally isolate themselves or even physically isolate themselves so that they can express those emotions in private. And really our society is terrible at that. As a society, we tell people grieve alone, you got to stay strong for the kids. No, you got to be human for the kids. You got to show them that it's normal to cry.
Right. Have you realized when a child falls down and scrapes their knee, a lot of times we're like, oh, stop. We try to stop them from crying and maybe say, well, here, eat this, right?
Here's a sucker.
Here, distract. Don't allow emotions to be shown. And in this case, we do need to let our emotions out.
Yeah.
It's like trying to cap a tea kettle, right? If we just try to cap it and don't let the steam out with the heat turned up, eventually you're going to have some explosion.
Yeah.
Just like in marriage. So we have to allow the free range of emotions. We have to let the emotions out, and not unhealthily. You get what we're saying. And
another one that we hear is, telling someone, we'll get a new one, whatever it is that was lost. And even if you will get a new one, that's not the best thing to say, because essentially you're teaching them that you need to replace the loss. And they apply these principles, whether that's to a child or to your spouse. They're going to apply that principle to the next loss that you guys experience. And it could be on a minor scale, and that's subjective according to the person, or a larger scale, but it still is they're going to apply that same principle that they got to replace the loss. And that's not always possible.
So if you're helping someone through grief right now, we've talked about what not to say. Let's talk about what to say. It's good to encourage them to be alone with their grief, but also to be together.
Yeah.
And it's a good balance. You don't want to have all one way or all the other. We need both. We need this time to process, to think, to cry by ourselves, but also to cry on a shoulder, to be tender. And we need to encourage them to open up and allow them to show the full range of their emotions and their sorrow and their sadness and their grief about what's happening. And maybe share the good memories and maybe the not so good memories, and just to reflect on what's going on for them.
A lot of times people express a guilt in response to a loss. I just feel so guilty. The last thing I said to them, or the last time I was with them, or I didn't do X, Y, and Z. And so if someone is feeling guilty, ask them, did you have intent to harm? And their answer is most likely going to be no. And then you let them know, well, guilt actually has to do with an intent to harm. That's the dictionary definition of guilt. It means that you intended to harm. So let's put guilt back into the dictionary and not allow yourself to become overwhelmed with that guilt because you did not have intent to harm.
Right.
Let them express what they're feeling, but then that's kind of a way that you can reassure is by asking about the intent to harm.
Right. And what they're feeling there is they have so many unsaid things. They're reacting to like, this is it, the finality of the moment. And I have more to communicate. I'm not ready to close this chapter because this is the end of the communication this way. But it's not the end of the relationship. And so sometimes we have unsaid things that need to be said.
Yep.
And so we can really put these into like 3 categories. The first thing would be apologies. Sometimes we need to say, I'm sorry for something that's happened. Sometimes the second one would be forgiveness. Sometimes we need to extend forgiveness. And remember that forgiveness is an action, not a feeling.
Right.
That when we say we forgive, we're giving up the hope for a different or better yesterday. That's what forgiveness is.
Yeah.
And so we're just saying, I'm ready to move on from this thing in the past. And you might not feel the forgiveness, but remember that the forgiveness is an action, not a feeling. So you could forgive without feeling the forgiveness. And the last thing would be just being able to express some emotion or unsaid statement, something that you need to say that's emotionally charged, but has deep meaning for you. So these are the 3 categories that can couch all of your unsaid feelings. And you might write them down. You might sit down and journal. This is what I'm sorry for. This is what I need forgiveness for. And this is what I have left to say to you.
That's good. We actually have folks do this type of thing. Often we call it the total truth letter, where, they, someone passed away, or even if maybe they left a certain lifestyle and now maybe they left a worldly lifestyle and now they're in church and they need to write this letter to that lifestyle. Maybe a person, but not necessarily a person, maybe just to that lifestyle. So dear old lifestyle, here's what I forgive you for. Here's what I am sorry for. And here's some unsaid emotional things that I still need to get out there. And so you're just being able to process through that and maintain a sense of balance in your life and to be able to get this stuff out on paper. So if you're the supporter, you might encourage them to write something like that. Another thing as far as supporting someone through grief is don't say that time heals all wounds, because that's not true. But action over time can heal. And so you might encourage them to take action, and that's one way to take action.
Also, this whole process can be very confusing, can be very overwhelming. And of course, family members come around you, and it's so helpful. But also a lot of times we do have people come to us that need support or need some guidance or need some tools for going through grief. And we just wanted to offer our help. If you would need that, feel free to reach out, DM us. We do online counseling all the time. A lot of our sessions are online. So feel free to reach out to us. It would be an honor to work with you. Absolutely. It would be an honor to work with you. And, if you are encouraging somebody to seek counsel, let them know it's okay to focus on the loss. So often we, with good intentions, we try to distract people from their loss, and we offer them all these activities to keep them busy. But it's okay to focus on the loss, and it's actually healthy to
to process through it by talking about it out loud, sometimes with a neutral third party. So feel free to reach out if you want to get some counseling, and we will let you know right away what the schedule looks like and see if we can get you in soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.